I never thought I would live to write this, not after the way the world around me fell apart. The war had been long and unforgiving, and I had come to see every day as a test of endurance rather than hope. I remember the nights in the trenches, the frost creeping into our blankets, and the constant, hollow rattle of distant artillery. There was a point when I stopped seeing the faces of the enemy as men at all. They were shadows, targets, obstacles to our survival. And yet, when the Americans came for us, I began to see the impossible truth that humanity could exist even across lines drawn by bullets and orders. I was captured on a cold morning in late November, the ground slick with rain and mud that seemed to pull my boots deeper into the earth with every step. I had surrendered because I had no strength left to fight, and the Americans had surrounded us without ceremony or cruelty, simply urging us to drop our weapons. Their voices were firm, but there was a calmness in them, a clarity I had not expected. My hands, trembling from exhaustion and the cold, met their gentle commands. I remember thinking, almost with disbelief, that there was no hate in their eyes, no bitterness at the uniform I wore, no mockery, no satisfaction in my defeat. They guided us into a clearing behind the lines, and I remembered the warmth of the small fire they had built, the smoke curling lazily into the gray sky. The Americans handed out blankets, and I was too exhausted to protest or refuse. One of them, a young man with a soft jawline and kind eyes, knelt beside me and offered a can of coffee. I accepted it, cautiously, unsure if it was a trick or some strange kindness I had never known. The warmth spread through me, not just physically, but in a way I cannot easily describe, like the first flicker of light in a long, dark tunnel. Days later, when morning came, I watched them move among the other prisoners with the same care. They helped the weak to their feet, guided the hungry to rations, and treated injuries without a word of judgment. I had been taught to believe that these people were monsters, but they were just men, and perhaps because of that, their decency felt revolutionary. I could hear the soldiers laughing quietly, sharing cigarettes with us, talking to us like neighbors rather than enemies. At first, it was almost unbearable, the sheer normalcy of it, because it reminded me of all the horrors I had survived and the times I had failed to see anyone as human. I remember the nights more vividly than the days. The wind would cut across the fields like a knife, and I would huddle under my thin blanket, listening to the others breathing, feeling the soft shuffle of boots as someone brought water or more rations. And there, in that quiet, I began to reflect. I thought about my own comrades and the orders we had followed blindly, about the moments when I had denied mercy or ignored suffering for the sake of duty. And yet, here were these Americans, showing patience and care without question, without expecting anything in return. The contrast shook me more than any shell had ever done at that moment. I began to understand something I had never admitted before. The war was not just a battle of nations or strategies. It was a test of our humanity. And I realized that in surrendering to them, I had not surrendered my life alone, but perhaps my bitterness and hardened heart as well. I don't know how to explain the relief I felt, knowing that the people who had the power to harm me chose instead to preserve me, to treat me as someone who could still deserve compassion. It was a quiet revolution of the soul, one that came not with fanfare or medals, but in the simple gestures of care that the Americans offered to us every day, I will try to write again tomorrow. To continue recounting what it felt like to witness kindness where I expected cruelty, to remember faces that shattered my assumptions, and to understand, at last, that humanity is something worth holding on to even in the shadow of war. When the first night passed, I began to notice the small rhythms of life among the Americans. They moved with a careful attentiveness that I had never seen from anyone in uniform before. The way they checked the wounded, distributed blankets, or quietly whispered instructions to one another. At first, I suspected these were habits of discipline, something drilled into them like we had been drilled. But slowly, I realized it was more than that. They cared, not for the glory of victory, not for the recognition of their superiors, but for us, for people who only hours before had been enemies. I remember sitting beside a small fire, the embers crackling faintly, and watching one of the soldiers tend to a man whose leg had been badly bruised. He murmured something I did not understand, perhaps a comfort, perhaps a word of reassurance, and the injured man nodded, eyes closed, and did not flinch. I had been raised to think that mercy was weakness, that showing care could invite destruction. Yet, here it was, offered freely, without. I remember feeling a pang of shame, shame for all the cruelty I had witnessed, all the fear I had justified as duty. The days blurred together. Rain fell and soaked our thin garments. Mud clung to our boots, and hunger gnawed at our bellies. Yet, even in discomfort, the Americans maintained a consistency that was almost startling. They shared what little they had, insisting that we take more than enough to eat, even if they were hungry themselves. One of them, a man perhaps no older than I was, handed me a piece of bread, and when I looked up, he smiled faintly, as if the gesture required no recognition, no gratitude. I accepted it, my hands shaking, because it was the first time in weeks that I felt I could trust someone completely. At night, we huddled in tents, and I heard whispers among the men, questions, quiet laughter, even songs that reminded me of home. It was strange and beautiful, the way life continued, even in captivity, even in the shadow of war. I thought of my comrades back home, the fear and suspicion that had governed every conversation, every decision, every small kindness we had denied to those we called the enemy. And I realized that fear had never been our true enemy. It was ignorance. It was the refusal to see others as human. I remember one morning when the sun broke through a gray sky, weak and trembling, and I saw an American kneeling to help a wounded German soldier tie his boot. The man did not speak. He only smiled faintly and handed him the boot. And in that moment, I saw a clarity I had never felt before, that courage and humanity are not the same thing as victory. One could win a battle and lose the soul. One could surrender and find it. I began to write again, careful not to be seen, documenting what I had never admitted aloud, that I was learning from the Americans, that my understanding of strength and honor was shifting beneath me. Their decency was not a story told in grand gestures or speeches. It was in the quiet, patient, tireless acts that reminded me we were all just people trying to survive. Even as the days passed and the monotony of captivity set in, the Americans never wavered. Their kindness was steady, unassuming, and unforced. And each time I watched it, I felt a small light inside me grow, warming places I had thought long dead: compassion, gratitude, the fragile hope that the world could still be more than fear and hatred. I do not yet understand the full measure of what this realization will mean for me, but I know it is irrevocable. I am beginning to see the humanity in others, even those I had been taught to despise, and in doing so, I am beginning to reclaim my own. I will write again tomorrow, to capture the quiet lessons I am learning, the small miracles of kindness that illuminate the darkness, and the slow, almost imperceptible change in a heart that once believed there was no place for mercy. The mornings grew colder as November gave way to December, and the wind cut across the camp like a blade. I remember wrapping my thin blanket tighter around my shoulders, shivering despite the fire, and watching the Americans go about their routines. They moved quietly, almost tenderly, checking the small details that could make life bearable, ensuring the weak had enough to eat, that the injured were moved carefully, that no one was left to suffer alone. It struck me how completely they had rejected the harshness I had come to expect from soldiers. Their discipline had a softness I had never associated with uniformed men. I recall one day, a young soldier came to me with a small cup of soup. The broth was thin, barely more than water and scraps, but it smelled warm and wholesome. He held it out with both hands, eyes steady on mine, and said something in English that I could not understand. I only nodded, accepting the cup, but in that gesture I felt a kindness that made me almost weep. It was a simple thing, a cup of soup, and yet it carried a weight I could not put into words, a recognition of my suffering, an acknowledgement that I was still human, still deserving of care. Days later, I found myself walking among the other prisoners, noticing the small gestures I had once ignored. A soldier helped another tie a torn sleeve. Someone offered a blanket to a man shivering beside the fire. They spoke softly, even when issuing commands, as if they were conscious of the fear and humiliation that already weighed heavily upon us. I had never seen anything like it. It was as though they had brought the decency of home with them into a place where cruelty was expected. At night, the wind howled through the tents, rattling the thin canvas and carrying the distant sounds of gunfire. Yet, even in those dark hours, I felt a strange sense of security. The Americans did not leave us to fend for ourselves. They remained vigilant, attentive, but never oppressive. I could hear their footsteps in the mud, their quiet voices offering reassurance, and in that rhythm, I felt the first real sense of calm in weeks, maybe months. I remember talking, or at least trying to talk, to one of them through broken words and gestures. I wanted to understand them, to see if the kindness I witnessed was genuine or some strange strategy. But it was real. I could see it in the way they moved, the way they offered, the way they treated even the smallest of us with the same patience they would show to a friend. It was unspoken, quiet, but undeniable, and slowly something shifted in me. I began to see the war differently, not as a binary struggle between enemies, but as a tragedy that involved men on all sides, each capable of fear, exhaustion, and longing. I realized how much I had dehumanized others in order to survive, how many times I had denied mercy because I thought it made me strong. Watching the Americans, I learned that strength was not measured in victories or the number of lives one could take or protect, but in the ability to act with compassion even when it was not required. I remember lying awake one night, listening to the rain on the tents, thinking about home, thinking about the choices I had made, and feeling a strange, quiet hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. I began to understand that even in the midst of war, even on the soil of defeat, there was room for humanity. I had been given a gift, the gift of witnessing it firsthand, the chance to see that kindness and decency could survive even in the darkest places. I will try to write again tomorrow. There are more small moments to record, more faces to remember, and more realizations that slowly change the way I see myself and the world. I feel as if I am beginning to understand what it truly means to be human. The days grew shorter, and the cold seeped into everything, our bones, our clothes, our very thoughts. Yet the Americans never seemed to let it harden them. I remember one morning when the frost coated the tents, turning each flap into a fragile sheet of ice. I shivered as I walked among the prisoners, but they moved with deliberate care, lighting fires, helping the weaker men to their feet, and distributing blankets without a single word of complaint. There was no hurry, no impatience, only a steady attention to what needed to be done. Watching them, I felt a quiet shame for the impatience and cruelty I had sometimes shown to those under my own command. I recall a small incident that left a lasting mark on me. A young German boy, barely 17, had twisted his ankle in the mud. He lay there, grimacing, unable to move without pain. One of the Americans immediately knelt beside him, speaking softly in a language I could not understand. He carefully lifted the boy, examined his ankle, and then adjusted the bandages with a tenderness that I had never seen in a soldier. I remember thinking, almost in disbelief, that I was watching someone treat an enemy not as a target, but as a person. That moment stayed with me, a quiet revelation that mercy was not weakness, but a strength I had never known. When evening came, the camp settled into a rhythm of soft murmurs and the occasional crackle of a fire. I sat against a tent pole, writing in the small notebook I had managed to keep hidden. My hands were stiff from the cold, but I wrote because I needed to record the way their decency had begun to alter me. Each gesture, each quiet act of kindness, felt like a small illumination in a darkness I had thought permanent. I began to notice the subtleties, the way they never forced us to speak if we could not, how they offered warmth and food without expecting gratitude, how they moved among us with patience that seemed almost unnatural to someone who had lived by fear. One afternoon, I was given a cup of thin coffee. The young soldier who handed it to me caught my eye and smiled faintly, as if to say, "It is enough. You are safe here." I remember feeling a lump rise in my throat because it was the first time in weeks that I had felt anything approaching relief. A sense of being seen not as an enemy, but as a human being who deserved care. There was no irony in it, no hidden threat, only the quiet assurance of presence. I began to talk to them when I could, stumbling over words, mixing German and English in awkward sentences. They listened, always with patience, sometimes repeating words until I understood. I realized that the language barrier mattered little. It was not words alone that conveyed their kindness, but the consistency of their actions, the calm in their movements, the genuine concern for the smallest suffering among us. And slowly, I started to think differently about the war. I had once believed that decency could only exist on my side, that any kindness from the Americans was either deceit or weakness. But I could not deny what I had seen. I had watched them care for strangers, feed the hungry, tend the sick, and comfort the frightened. I had watched them do all of this without expecting recognition or reward. And I began to see that courage and humanity were not mutually exclusive, that it was possible to fight a war and still preserve the soul. I lie awake some nights, listening to the wind in the tents, thinking about the men who surround me, and I realize how much I have changed. The anger and suspicion I carried have begun to soften, replaced by a quiet understanding that humanity can exist even where I once thought it impossible. There is still fear, still uncertainty, but it is tempered now by a hope that was once unimaginable. I will write again tomorrow to capture the quiet lessons, the small miracles of kindness, and the slow but undeniable change in a heart that had once known only fear and duty. The snow began to fall lightly, dusting the tents and the mud with a fragile white that seemed almost too gentle for the world we had lived in. I remember waking early, shivering under my thin blanket, and stepping outside to watch the Americans move among us. They carried buckets of water, checked the fires, and ensured that everyone had at least a small measure of warmth. The frost made the air sharp, but their presence somehow made it bearable, as if decency itself could stave off the cold. I recall one moment in particular. A fellow prisoner, older and frailer than most, had struggled to rise from the ground. One of the Americans knelt, guiding him patiently to his feet, adjusting his blanket and his jacket. The man's face was lined with exhaustion, yet his voice was soft, steady, without a trace of reprimand or irritation. I watched, almost holding my breath, as the older prisoner smiled faintly, a small expression of relief and gratitude. It struck me how something so simple, so quiet, could carry more weight than any battlefield victory I had ever known. Days passed in a rhythm that was strangely comforting. There was work to do, yes, and the cold pressed on us relentlessly. But the Americans maintained a steady calm that was infectious. I found myself noticing things I had long ignored, the way a soldier would pause to help tie a boot, the way he would share his own rations without hesitation, the way he would speak softly to those who could barely muster words in reply. Their decency was not loud or showy. It was consistent, patient, and enduring. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a muted gray, I watched a small group of Americans laughing quietly over a card game. One of them gestured for a few of us prisoners to join, and despite my initial hesitation, I accepted. We shuffled cards awkwardly, laughed in broken languages, and for a few fleeting hours, the war seemed almost to dissolve. I remember thinking how absurd and miraculous it was that the same people who had captured us could also offer moments of connection and simple joy. I had never expected such a thing. At night, I began to write more freely, documenting the faces, the small gestures, and the quiet acts of kindness that were changing how I saw the world. I reflected on my own comrades, on the fear and suspicion that had guided every interaction, and I felt a deep sorrow for all the times I had denied humanity to those I was taught to hate. The Americans were teaching me, without words, that compassion was not weakness, that strength could coexist with mercy, and that even in the shadow of war, it was possible to act with integrity. I remember one cold morning when the wind had sharpened to a biting edge. A young soldier, noticing me shivering, placed a blanket over my shoulders and adjusted my scarf without a word. It was a simple act, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, I understood that the war, for all its brutality, did not have to define every action, that the choice to care was always possible, even in the darkest of times. Slowly, I began to feel a shift inside myself. The anger, the fear, and the suspicion that had shaped me for so long began to soften. I could see now that humanity was not tied to flags, uniforms, or allegiances. It existed wherever people chose to honor it. I had been given a rare gift, the chance to witness kindness and decency in the most unlikely of places, to see that the enemy could be more humane than the world had allowed me to imagine. I will try to write again tomorrow, to remember the faces, the small gestures, and the quiet lessons that continue to change how I see myself and others. Perhaps someday I will carry these lessons beyond this camp, beyond the war, as a reminder that even in despair, humanity can endure. The days grew even colder, and the snow thickened, crunching underfoot with every cautious step. I remember waking one morning to find the Americans already moving among the prisoners, tending to the fires, checking blankets, and quietly offering help wherever it was needed. Their actions were deliberate and gentle, yet firm, as though kindness required both patience and resolve. I had long believed that mercy was a luxury the battlefield could not afford. But here it was, being offered freely, without hesitation, and it was transforming me in ways I could hardly describe. I recall a moment when a fellow prisoner had become ill, shivering violently under a thin coat and muttering incoherently. One of the Americans knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, speaking softly, and carefully adjusting his blanket. The man worked patiently, never showing frustration, never speaking a word that could be taken as judgment. I watched from a distance, my heart tightening, realizing for the first time how much I had taken for granted in my own life, the simple dignity of being cared for when one is at one's lowest. Even the small things struck me deeply. The way they shared rations quietly, the way they made sure the weak were not left behind during marches, the way they maintained a calm presence even when chaos loomed nearby. I began to understand that decency was not an occasional act, but a constant effort, a deliberate choice that required courage equal to, if not greater than, the courage demanded on the battlefield. I started to pay closer attention to these gestures, letting them sink in, imprint themselves on a heart that had grown accustomed to suspicion. One evening, as the wind whipped snow across the frozen ground, a young American soldier approached me and offered a piece of bread. His hands were red from the cold, but he held it out without a word of complaint, without a hint of expectation. I accepted it and met his eyes, and there was a moment, brief, fragile, when it felt as if the world had narrowed to that single act of generosity. I realized then that I had been wrong to believe the enemy could not be human, could not care, could not act with honor. They could, and they did. I began to notice the quiet camaraderie among the Americans themselves, their patience with one another, their soft laughter, and their gentle remonstrances when someone faltered. It was unlike anything I had ever seen among my own comrades, whose bonds were often hardened by fear and suspicion rather than kindness. And in observing them, I felt a subtle shift in myself, a growing recognition that trust and empathy were not weaknesses but strengths. That the ability to extend a hand instead of a fist could be revolutionary even in the midst of war, night after night. I scribbled in my notebook, trying to capture these moments, these lessons that seemed too important to forget. I wrote about the firelight reflecting on frost-covered tents, the sound of soft voices comforting the weary, and the way even the smallest gestures could hold more meaning than any orders, medals, or proclamations. I wrote about hope, fragile, tenuous, but undeniably present, and about the sense that perhaps, if we could learn to carry this humanity forward, the world could endure beyond the violence that had engulfed us. And slowly, I understood that I was beginning to change. The bitterness that had once clung to me, the fear that had guided so many of my actions, began to loosen. I felt a growing sense of connection, not only to the Americans who tended to us, but to the shared human experience that they seemed to honor with every choice. For the first time, I saw that enemies could be teachers, that kindness could break through even the hardest of hearts, and that humanity could survive. Even when war threatened to erase it, I will write again, to continue tracing these small miracles, these quiet lessons, and the slow transformation of a heart that had long thought itself beyond repair. Perhaps, in recording them, I can remember that even in the darkest times, there are lights that endure. The days began to lengthen slightly, though the cold remained unrelenting. I woke one morning to the faint glow of dawn touching the frost-covered tents, and for the first time in months, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. The Americans were already awake, moving among us with their usual patience, checking fires, distributing rations, and quietly ensuring that no one was left behind. It had become almost a rhythm, one that offered reassurance and a strange, steady comfort. I realized that I had begun to rely on this steadiness, on their calm humanity, as much as I had once relied on training or duty. I remember a young soldier sitting beside me one afternoon, sharing a cigarette. We did not speak much. Our broken words barely conveyed our thoughts, but there was a connection there, an unspoken acknowledgement that despite the uniforms we wore, despite the war and all it demanded, we were both human. I felt a strange warmth, not from the cigarette or the brief sun, but from the simple recognition of that shared humanity. It was a quiet lesson, but one that spoke louder than any command I had ever followed or order I had ever given. There were moments of laughter, too, small and fleeting, as Americans and prisoners alike shared stories, muddled by language and fatigue. At first, it felt almost unreal that we could laugh together after so much fear and suffering. And yet, in those moments, I understood something essential, that the war, for all its brutality, could not entirely extinguish the spark of connection between people. Even in captivity, even on foreign soil, there was room for trust, for compassion, and for the simple recognition of one another's worth. Lying awake beneath my thin blanket, I reflected on how much I had changed. I thought of my comrades, of the fear and suspicion that had governed our every move, and of the rigid lines we had drawn between ourselves and the enemy. I realized that those lines were not fixed by nature, but by choice, by fear, and by the refusal to see others as fully human. Watching the Americans, I had learned that these lines could be softened, even erased, by kindness, patience, and courage. I remember the final morning of my capture, the air sharp and clear with frost, The Americans moved with the same attentiveness I had come to rely upon, helping the weak to their feet, distributing food, and ensuring that no one was left in discomfort. I stood among the other prisoners, and for the first time, I felt a sense of gratitude so profound that it nearly overwhelmed me, not only for the food or the blankets, but for the gift of witnessing humanity in its purest form, for the lesson that even in the midst of war, it is possible to act with decency and compassion. As I write this, I understand that the war will continue to shape the world, and perhaps shape me as well. But I also know that something irreversible has happened within me. I have seen the enemy act with kindness. I have felt the warmth of care where I expected none. And I have learned that true strength lies not in the taking of life, but in the preservation of humanity. I will carry these memories forward, long after the snow has melted and the guns have fallen silent. The Americans taught me, without words or grand gestures, that it is possible to see others as people, not enemies, that mercy and courage are not opposites, but companions, and that even in the darkest times there is light to be found in simple acts of kindness. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, but I write this now to remember that even in a world of war, there is the capacity for humanity, and that those moments of compassion can change a life forever.